Hello everyone, today we talk again about post-Carolingian Europe and especially about the enormous relevance of the episcopal power achieved in the cities, right? We don't have to forget, however, that the roots of the episcopal power laid in a religious prestige and an economical base that stretched beyond the city in which they resided. So to get the essentials right, if you're a regular follower, surely I've repeated the stuff ad nauseum, but in general we're talking about post-Carolingian Europe as largely also as post-Roman Europe, as a Roman Catholic Europe, and therefore an ecclesiastical power that had started from the Roman city, that had remained in different degree the center, the point of reference of government, and especially of public one, that the Carolingians had made in fact an effort to centralize, and of course to do this on the basis of the cities, where the bishops were already, generally speaking, also as the descendants, literally, of the senators of the counts, of those who had, and they were lords like others. This is the point we're seeing today. But of course the church had a specific role that, as also I was answering in one question and answer video, in fact, recently, was of different nature, was developing an internal organization that, especially in post-Carolingian times, had gone beyond already the in the West, what instead would have been normal, say in Constantinople, that is properly the subjection of the church to the emperor. Post-Carolingian Europe, public, that is secular authority, collapses, and so the system gets dramatically privatized on the base that the Carolingians had laid in terms of the vassalic beneficiary clienteles that were, especially north of the Alps, already basically the standard in terms of, given that power was entirely private practice. But that is a privatization that is pursued in the creation, as we know, as we've seen, maybe some time ago at this point, we will have to come back on that, but notoriously, right, in this proliferation of lordships, starting literally from a local level, sometimes a small one, sometimes we're already a larger one, let's say, but in that intricate, let's say, what would become essentially a feudal forest, let's say, and quite intricate one, from which eventually probably the larger feudal powers will stem from very gradually. And the church was doing exactly the same things that the lay nobility did, with this essentially urban bias that was stronger, of course, in southern Europe as more than in central Europe, but that especially, in fact, in the post-Roman areas, and just, in fact, the most important ones, even for these kingdoms. So we're talking about definitely great part of Gaul, especially the south, the Italic kingdom, the Rhineland as well, and in other areas where the communal phenomenon, as we will see now, also will, prosper. That, of course, gave sort of an extra gear to the ecclesiastical administration, and we have not made enough videos about this, but consider that many instances the bishops had literally taken over the public prerogatives locally, because at the end of the day that got down to that the idea that it was a kingdom and even an empire remained. It was convenient for everybody involved. It's just that at a local level, of course, these prerogatives, public rights, were very often subcontracted because they were recognized also by public authority. That was factually just another private one, but still, formally having that best. And it's obvious that the city had remained the heart, right, of the diocese, and therefore the bishop center of power. So we're talking, especially in the the more urbanized areas, of really imposing systems. The city in itself, especially one is properly of Roman foundation and pretty important, relevant one, would still have massive walls, stone palaces, right? The idea of the palatium, it's something that in certain areas of Europe, especially in the north, never seen, right? The idea of having a massive stone structure to where also powered its office, its troops, etc., would be stationed. It's a big deal. It's a form of power that fundamentally was continuing the imperial one and the grandeur that was attached to it, and that meant in the city that was merely from a socio-economical point of view only, where the place where the countryside surplus was accumulated, where therefore people had to be kind of more literate, more capable, more skilled as artisans, but also properly as clerics, as officials, of people who knew law, and if anything knew how to read and write, and that in fact mostly worked in the bishop's entourage, were really a very important nucleus of power, were to extend eventually the lordship beyond. And so, as we have just said, many bishops were also endowed with, provided with, because they were also simply taking over them themselves, massive assets in the countryside. Because at the end of the day, the real, the city exists because there is a countryside, fundamentally, that allows that surplus to be concentrated there historically. And as we were saying before, this bishop's lifestyle basically didn't differ at all, especially places like Gaul, especially in the Frankish heartland. But this was true by a certain degree everywhere in post-Carolingian Europe. From the secular one, right? They were literally the same people coming from the same families. These were men of war, right? They were large private landowners with military retinues and this extensive estates which they retain control of. And there would be many other implications here regarding eventually the following development of ecclesiastical lordships, but also the communal phenomenon. Maybe we'll talk about it in the end. But what is important about this last aspect, that is properly the extension of the episcopal assets and lands in outside the city, is that we're talking about rural areas where the seigneurial rights of landed and banal character. I made a video if you don't know what banal lordship is, but go look at that. Found in the local communities much less limitation than in the city. What does this mean practically? Is that, of course, the episcopal rural possessions were essentially ever more similar and practically indistinguishable in nature from the rest of the secular lordships. And this divide, as we were hinting at before, did exist factually, because while it is true that the city was effectively, especially in post-Roman Europe, this is very evident, for example, in Gaul, in Italy, etc., where also the Franks properly had habituated to rule from. You know that the Carolingians in northern France did not really reside in cities. They had massive households in the countryside, etc. That becomes a bit stereotypical. Actually, cities were quite important there. Were all cities of Roman origin, and yet they weren't like quite capitals as we intended them. But part of the reason why this divide, let's say, there was objectively a divide between the comital power and the ecclesiastical one, is obviously that let's say historically the ecclesiastical one, first of all, was older, right? These were families, as we've seen, of senatorial origin. Some of the oldest and most important feudal families in Europe, even the Habsburgs, seemingly were stemmed from the Romano-Burgundian they essentially had retained, if anything, culturally by lifestyle in the city, a kind of culture that, generally speaking, was also more elevated than the one of the invaders, of the Germanic peoples, that therefore had seen, especially in the first times of the Germanic settlement, etc., say the idea that Germans would mostly settle in the most militarized areas, and or preferably even outside the city, because that's what they were habituated to, right? The controlling the land, because that's also what they needed. And so the city remaining a little bit more kind of the bishop's thing, in this kind of wake of Roman culture and literacy and broader legacy that, however, had unavoidably between the elites intertwined, right? And so the invaders had settled in the cities as well, but they had been assimilated first. In fact, even those lords of Germanic origin had immediately essentially become more functionally kind of Romanized in the city, and they and therefore they had maintained, or the advantages, the privileges that condition had remained. So historically, even after the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, but even before actually, there is a greater divide between, let's say, the bishop, city, and countryside lay, let's say, secular lord, right? And it is indeed important because, as you know, from Roman times, the cities had also declined. So while in some countries like Italy, for example, even when that had happened, the city had always remained literally the center of the countryside, even properly administratively speaking. There was no place in the country that was not heading towards the city. In areas like Germany or France, etc., there were some areas, at least, that were these big wards of not just of the countryside, but very often also of the forest, of communities that had lived disconnected even from the bigger circuits. So every situation is different, and we'll look at that in detail at some point. But it's obvious that when the broader patrimonial, in this broader privatization dynamic, the patrimonial interests got blended both in the city and the countryside. It's obvious that whatever lands the bishops owned in the countryside, they were kind of of the same nature in a seigneurial sense of the lay nobility. And this helps to understand how from the 11th century onwards, so in this moment also reactivation of properly demographic growth, economical development, and so on, we can see the formation of some very vast ecclesiastical dominations of remarkable territorial coherence. So as in this time some kingdoms properly were retaking shape from a feudal base, etc., equally the ecclesiastical lordships were at the point, in fact, of competing with the principalities of the major seigneurial dynasties. And we're talking in some cases not only of, in fact, the government of cities with landed curtes and fortresses by work of a single church, but actually of a true and proper unitary territorial organism, which is a big deal because, as we were saying before, these territorial dominations had been born historically in a very, if not random, but, very disorderly fashion, at least if, they had a firm logical coherence politically, militarily, but let's say if you had to depict them on a map, and you even can't, it would have been something, extremely messy. Bishops, exactly because of this, of the urban center and this greater administrative skills of their personnel, etc., and their means and prestige and political connection, international, charisma and all these things, gave rise to more compact territorial realities. And this is quite interesting because we're also, as we'll see now, framed among some of the most powerful seigneurial ones, or next to them, and considered in this sense always that the church and the state were recognized already in the West as two separated things, as far as the two spheres of respective sphere of pertinences were concerned. So we have also talked about the bishops' counts that are one of the most famous feature in European politics and administration, especially during the 10th century. We mostly stressed it for the Ottonians and especially their Italian policy, but actually these figures were present in all the post-Carolingian kingdoms. As we were saying before, the kings had conferred to bishops the rule in cities that very often royal power could not reach. This was very evident, for example, in France during the Norman invasions and all these things. Those, let's say, a comital power, right? So, well, they weren't quite counts, literally, and this is not to be misinterpreted, but they were formally conferred comital powers. That is to say, what had been the average district, very often centered on a city, where a bishop and a count ruled separately, exercising the two different, spiritual and secular functions, respectively, were summed in one figure that was very often the bishop, right? More than the count, because as we've seen before, the bishop was already historically based in the city. It would have never gone away because his functions were connected to the city and the diocese. That's it. Whereas the count was very often, somebody from the royal clientele that, had gone at war with the king. Also bishops that matter, but let's say was kind of more the average secular guy, in terms of at least of the elite, that was conferred like a, this public secular power over that district, and was more likely, because of all what happened with the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, to just bail out from the city, where, by the way, the bishop already exercised the real power, as we've seen, as a lord, and try for more fortune in the countryside, where, it had been possible to do. And this thing of conferring comital power to bishops was surely a way to grant to some powerful church, a territorially coherent sphere for the exercise of functions of political nature. And as we've seen, this was a huge advantage for a public authority like the royal and imperial one, because the bishops had children, had families, but they could not inherit because they didn't own the church's property personally, right? When they died, another bishop was elected. So this was much more. These figures were much more convenient for the public power to, first of all, kind of sometimes even depose and put somebody else. I mean, they did it even with the Pope in Ottonian times. As we'll see now, it was mostly confirming actually whoever was the bishop there and that already ruled de facto, and simply getting his support through the formalization of this comital conferment. But it was a much better option, however, still than the secular elite, because that would have tended to consider their possessions as kind of private stuff that would have, by the way, been split at the death of the ruler and all these things. So it was a very complicated situation, because initially, at least in Carolingian times, even before, at least in theory, the public office conferred by the king were public, like just in Roman times. So in theory, even at the death of the secular holder of these rights, those rights would have had to be reverted to the king. But as we were saying before, this kind of never happened because the system was already private, especially north of the Alps, and this had the same reason in great part of the decline of the Carolingian power, right? Because as soon as they stopped the war of invasions, etc., what did they have for for this power to stand on its feet alone at home. Nothing, because it was based all on private property. It was based on the rewards coming, the sharing of the loot, the confirming of these public prerogatives stripped by somebody else. Very often the church, as it happened also in the early Carolingian times, because the church, the bishops, had usurped objectively those rights in Merovingian times during the collapse of the kingdom even there. And therefore, as we know, Carolingians began to fight against each other, essentially. That's how the Carolingian Empire crumbled, right? It was not foreign invasions. It was just essentially a consequence of the internal dissolution. It all happened by itself. And in post-Carolingian times, however, the bishop count thing, one would think, would benefit mostly public authority. Well, in part it did, in a sense. There were important imperial even policies were built on this. But in practice, what we actually see is that the greatest beneficiaries were the same bishops, because such conferment was, and generally speaking, the overlapping of episcopal prerogatives from a territorial point of view with the public commental ones was officially properly recognized according to the frames that were suggested at that point by the actually swinging articulations, say the same commental articulations of the kingdoms. This is quite important. We made a video in autumn about the Duchy of Burgundy. We've seen even these, how, county, duchy, what is that? That was swinging at the time. There were some realities that took different form in that regard, and that by private expansion were also molding the same public boundary, right? The commental, the county was kind of the base of the Frankish administrative system. Then the ducal power was conferred to figures that were kind of more, and therefore to the districts that ruled it, were kind of more important in some fashion, politically, strategically. So there wasn't even in post-Carolingian times like a standard absolute definition of what a commental power would be. It would be largely kind of the public prerogatives on that district of what was historically recognized as such. But this was the time in which both lay and ecclesiastical lords were kind of literally redrawing those political boundaries, not excessively, because generally speaking, what had been the districts of the Roman administration remained in practice. But let's say the construction of larger territories, etc., through the sum of the same and some kind of border redefinition, etc., were always there, and it was difficult to control that, because different, let's say, counties could earn at that point different prerogatives for how they had come to be formed privately. So the exercise of temporal power from the side of kings or emperors assumed real and long-lasting coherence only if the constitutive act was grafted on a or still, say, already going political process. It was also done on the basis of the immunities that were conferred at that point both to ecclesiastical and lay lords, right? Think about the allod and the idea at some point these centuries that there were some core possessions that could not be touched, and for the church that had already been the case historically. But that could go, and this is how such prerogatives were extended very often, through the acquisition of other ones, on other goods, on other possessions. That is, how much did that church or district, public district, actually own historically. For example, the acquisition of forestal spaces of domanial origin. That is to say, historically the forest, was, especially in early medieval times, a quite remunerative source of goods, right? For, pigs, for fish, for collecting some fruits. It was incredibly important economically wise, and it had remained, in this sense, mostly in the Romano-Germanic kingdoms, a king's possession, right? Personal king's possession. Well, these forests were sometimes eventually given to these lords, lay and ecclesiastical alike, in exchange for the recognition of the royal authority. This is how the churches were endowed by the kings, and also with the task very often of gradual plowing and colonization, because starting from the 11th century, there is a dramatic, expansive capacity of Europeans to literally redraw even the countryside properly, and starting to colonize and to deforestate and so on. In this massive private process of entrepreneurial process of land management, that is the one from which effectively also the later economical development, even the same one of the cities, as a matter of fact, started from, right? Connecting, we have seen it very often in the medieval society playlist, how big this thing was, how it was effectively not the cities or the merchants who made the economical rebirth happen, but it was actually the feudal system that wasn't at all a closed or short range or barter based thing, right? And the magnitude of these lords' power is just the proof of that. So this practically translated into the further consolidation of local powers in a way or another, and this was important for the same public authority, because, as we've seen many times, it was much easier to control like a more powerful nobleman than many small ones at some point. So the risks at some levels of political disgregation kind of were inferior to the benefits, even of the need of political control. That's how feudal Europe was born, in a way. And so, generally speaking, the bishops benefited enormously from this. Think about the communal movement in Italy. We will see it now. That would come, paradoxically, to disturb the same ecclesiastical power, because the communes took over the control on the district, and even expanding it further in Italy, because they were acting on behalf of the bishops' prerogatives. There were the Commental and also the ecclesiastical ones. That is to say, whatever had belonged to these prelates was now taken by the commune, at least managed by the commune, and factually controlled and ruled the city. But this could happen in great part. Communes started delving from the 11th century. If you look at the 10th century and the bishop counts policy that the Ottonians enacted in Italy, you see there that the way the Ottonians had managed to control the land, where, as we've seen, the cities were the core of the center of power in the Italic kingdom, over the entire countryside, was becoming ever more, was to essentially consolidate, to confirm the position of the bishops that already ruled in those cities, and strengthening their power further. It was a urban power, right? And so this urban power grew further, as it was already doing by itself, was confirmed further by the imperial government, and so eventually this prosperity, socio-economical development, brought to the secular councils to take over even the ecclesiastical prerogatives and to start the communes. This is a very important phenomenon. And in fact, this is the strong economic growth and the strong political ambitions of the urban centers per se, that in certain areas had always had it uninterruptedly since the Roman Empire. It was quite evident, as the city had remained, in fact, in the Italic kingdom, the center, as we've seen, not just of power in general, but also properly of a lay elite, that was literate, that was juridically advanced, administratively advanced, often working for the bishop, but as laymen. This is yet another very important aspect of these areas. So I chose today two examples exactly from the Italic kingdom that are quite eloquent, because they are part of this of the same process, but also they had different outcomes, and they are somewhat peculiar. So they're similar in constitutionally speaking, but they're different in outcome. In fact, even when they were grafted in, processes were already going. So these two examples are the Patriarchate of Aquileia and the Episcopal of Asti. So these are two essentially northern Italian cities, both Roman in origin, both framed within the Italic kingdom of the Longobards and eventually of the Carolingians, and so within the Holy Roman Empire. And in fact, and having these local churches, right, and quite important ones. Asti, as you know, it's in Piedmont and was a smaller center, had kind of more like a commercial nature that would increase further, and it had its own diocese, its own bishop. Aquileia is kind of more interesting in a sense, was a more important city, and it had witnessed the split of the episcope during the Longobard invasion, because basically part of the episcopate that had and properly the bishop had fled to Grado, which is essentially an island. This is an isthmus that connects to the mainland where Aquileia stands, and that in Grado the Byzantines would stay, and while Aquileia was occupied by the Longobards, and there was this rivalry that sometimes took an interesting ecclesiological forms. We will talk about it at some point, but at this point, Aquileia was more important, was also an important center, probably of the older Roman of the area in northeastern Italy, and importantly connected also to Germany, because this area, northeastern Italy, in the post-Carolingian repartitions of various kingdoms, actually fell into the Eastern Germanic kingdom. So across the Alps, south of the Alps, from the Italian watershed, and it was included in Bavaria, essentially at the beginning, and the area would remain historically very much connected to southeastern Germany in general. And the Patriarch of Aquileia was also a very important figure, in fact, in the Holy Roman Empire. Charismatically, spiritually, the patriarchs were very involved in German policy, more than others of the rest of northern Italy, and for these reasons as well. So in the second half of the 11th century, so relatively late actually, both the episcopes of Aquileia and Asti had been provided by the German king with coherent comital areas, right? So it's interesting that this was still going on later on, after the Ottonians, after basically the greater part of the loss of the grip over the Italic kingdom by the same German kings, and the rise, the incipient rise of the communal phenomenon in a few decades, and in part probably also because of this, because the German king wanted to retain on this diocese a greater control, and both bishops were already from quite a while in possession of rather consistent land assets and of massive forestal areas to plow. The low medieval development of these ecclesiastical lordships was different. So the Patriarchate of Aquileia, famously enough, was arguably, after the Church of Rome, was the most powerful ecclesiastical power in the Italic, let's say in Italy, and maintaining essentially a an important temporal power over a rather large district. It fundamentally corresponds to the modern Friul. And there were naturally some secular powers that coexisted, also were properly vassals of the bishop within the land. And this power went on consistently for an important time. It had important connections with Central Europe, with German policy, even with Bohemian policy, and it persisted up to the 15th century in ever better territorially organized forms until essentially the Venetians took over. Right in the 15th century, Venice basically builds quite quickly this massive terra firma state that incorporates the same patriarchate that declines politically, and so also in its larger fundament. Asti instead was phagocytated, as we were saying before, by the commune. That is to say, the episcopate began to suffer the political competition of the great commercial center of Asti itself, even though juridically, because this is how it formally remained, the bishop had obtained from the German emperors since the 10th century the districtus on the city of Asti and its immediate surroundings. In fact, in which they kept building fundamentally important, other churches and controlling them, and so on. The districtus is fundamentally it's a later term actually that, however, refers to the territorial district in which the lord, fundamentally the landed lord and the feudal one, had the faculty of and that's hence the term districtus, distringere, that is to exercise coaction on the vassals and on those that inhabited within the same district were subject to them and to him directly. So this was a very important prerogative. But the Astian commune was stronger, and so the episcope as territorial power dissolved during the course of the communal era. As many other episcopal powers in Italy, this was kind of more, the case of Asti was kind of more paradigmatic, right? The bishop is gradually excluded from the actual direct control of the district. Whereas a city like Asti, we could talk about it at some point, also waged war outside the district, kind of in southwestern Piedmont, had this kind of interesting involvement in wars and all these things. And the creation of the ecclesiastical principality of the Patriarchate of Aquileia instead is exceptional within the Italic kingdom because of its compactness and for how long it lasted. So much that, as we've seen, this analogy between Germany and northeastern Italy that finds similar comparisons in those same centuries, in fact, in the Eastern Frankish kingdom. For example, with the domination of the bishops of Utrecht in the Netherlands, to the duchy of bishops of Würzburg in central Germany. This is quite interesting because the bishops became also dukes at some point. And you know that we made a video recently about the privatization of the episcopal investitures in the kingdom of Germany, exactly in those centuries, especially after, in the decades after the Concordat of Worms, that basically brought to literally the diocese to be conferred like as if it was a fief, like a private possession of the same prelates, rather than the standard kind of ecclesiastical good that the emperor tributed and normal platted when the next bishop was elected. So real lords of the land, right? The famous principality of the archbishops of Salzburg in southern Bavaria, and also the ones of the bishops of Trent, that is on the Italian watershed in northern Italy, but that was considered circumscriptionally at the time as part of the German kingdom, not the Italic one. And it was actually close to Aquileia. In fact, these bishops were, again, the ones that were saying were quite involved in German policy by themselves, and also among each other, that they had their own interests. And this is interesting because there was also rivalry of some sort, right? And dated back to very far in time, even Longobards times. And the German comparison is important because also in Germany there was a communal flourishing at some point. And however, only in the Italic kingdom, the communal cities expressed those vast territorial ambitions that came to substitute the political constructions of the ecclesiastical and secular princes. So Aquileia is an exception because in that sense it resembles more what happened in Germany, where in spite of the development of the communal phenomena, the German cities the German communes never had a government that went outside the city walls practically. They managed sometimes to expel even the bishop. Even in the case of Cologne, it was the largest one, the most important one, the most important German city and the most important German archbishopric, but they didn't create a territorial lordship that was able to oust the episcopal power, because that was all around, right? And so what you see with Aquileia is very similar to what happening actually in the majority of the German ecclesiastical principalities. That is to say, the continuation, at least in the case of Aquileia up to the 15th century, of a princely, it's an ecclesiastical princely power in the land, right? So as bishop lords that lasted up to, sometimes in Germany, up to the secularization of 1806 with Napoleon. So this dynamic, I think, is very important, very big, because from one side it's not much picturing the power of bishops in post-Carolingian Europe and even later on, and how politically and institutionally relevant and consistent they had become, but also how in different post-Carolingian kingdoms the relation with the city brought to different outcomes of the same, and how you can spot these exceptions that in a sense the comparison of Asti and Aquileia highlight. And then we will talk about these various centers. I realize I want to go in depth. I want to really, especially in the post-Carolingian kingdoms, but not only, to look at all these various cities, relations with the bishops, because they tell you a lot of how power was actually held and exercised and recognized, and I think it's crucial to, if one doesn't really get these things, doesn't really get the Middle Ages, I would say. It's just like a blob of prejudices and kind of strange projections, but this is the actual history. This is what actually happened in terms of power dynamics, and that's why it's incredibly important to talk about it. So for now, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.